Because of its need for audience, viewers, and social contact, the cultural sector was hit hard by the pandemic, and many organizations connected with humanities still face challenges with recovery. That's the main reason why Mass Humanities will try to help organizations with grants made possible by federal relief money. To tell us about the application process for SHOP grants for COVID response is the Executive Director of Mass Humanities, Brian Boyles. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
It's great to be here.
Brian, I want to have you put this in context, because I guess what we're really talking about here is cultural recovery. I know that means more than just reopening things. So how would you define it?
The humanities and the cultural sector are the paving and the pathway to this recovery. So for us, we really feel like in every community around the Commonwealth, people will need to turn to their libraries and museums and cultural centers, just as you and I are, getting ourselves reoriented in our communities and in the world, getting back to our roots and getting back to these spaces where we can have the conversations about what happened, where we're going to go next. That seems very key to the recovery for us, and it's why we're excited to be able to provide additional support this year for organizations around the state.
Well, beyond getting people safely back to work, what about the other aspects of recovery? And maybe I'm thinking here about the Frederick Douglass readings. Why was that so important?
Mass Humanities has been supporting public readings of Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," for 12 years now. Last year, most of those readings moved online, but in most years, these are things that happen on the town common, in front of City Hall, or outside or inside museums and local historical societies. This year, people were able to get back to many of the sites that they usually do these readings. And impressively, we went from funding 10 organizations to do readings in 2009 in person to 20 organizations this year, as well as a few other communities that organize their own readings. I think that's why it's important for the recovery, and what it signifies to us is in these very few first weeks or month when people are comfortable getting back out there, being vaccinated and feeling like they want to reconnect with their neighbors, these communities in Massachusetts chose to tackle this very challenging, very moving speech about the legacy of slavery. That to me indicates a thirst for a reckoning and for a rebuilding that the humanities will be central to. And the Douglass readings just really to us were reemphasizing why it's important to support these organizations and these people who so bravely take on these challenges, even as we continue to work through the recovery from the pandemic.
Your SHOP grants only go up to about $20,000, and these, I guess, ought to be going to organizations, some of which maybe before the pandemic didn't readily think of themselves as being involved in humanities as we usually think about that. But what could humanities mean as far as the eligible activities?
Well, the humanities are the ways that we reconnect with the past, or the messages we leave for the future, and the conversations we have with each other to understand each other better as human beings. Now, that leaves a pretty broad sector of organizations and spaces where that kind of work can be done. For this opportunity, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is our parent organization and where the funds came from through the American Rescue Plan, really wants us to put this into the infrastructure for the humanities. So again, that is your local museum or historical society, your library branch, or your cultural center. And they do a diverse amount of work in the humanities in serving those communities. Mass Humanities is committed to also partnering with our health and human service organizations, community development corporations. And this opportunity, I think, is more for that traditional organization, but we do have a lot of different funding opportunities out there to continue to build audience. What's important with $20,000 maximum grants that we have offered right now is we're offering several different ways that an organization can make their case. So an organization may simply need to replace its revenue. They've lost more than $500 million in the cultural sector over the last year. The state's Commission on Cultural Impact of COVID thinks that there's at least $2 billion in revenue every year that comes through this sector. They can also look at retraining their staff. Staff needs to take into consideration new aspects around both audience outreach, building more inclusive programming, and then just the professional development that every organization needs. We're also offering support to build out upgrades that make the programming stronger, that reach bigger audiences. And we're also saying to some of the organizations that maybe aren't quite sure what they need because it is so early, there's a $5,000 grant that says you may be at the very beginning of this journey, but we want you to have the funding to do some planning, to do some research, to identify what your needs are, to maybe grow a strategic plan that allows you to look at reopening and recovery as the beginning of a new chapter for your organization. These funds all kickstart those types of efforts. And, you know, whether it's a library or a large corporation, I think everyone's going through that right now. These funds are our ways to really strengthen those efforts.
What we've seen over the past year and a half are a lot of stopgap adaptations, especially to virtual programming. But some groups seem to want to keep going in that direction, at least as part of their strategy. Could these grants help with that?
Certainly. So there is funding in here available if you're developing new programs to reach audiences. And the lessons learned through the pandemic were, while we all enjoy the in-person engagement, there's an access question. Not everyone is able to come down in the evening and go to that local museum or afford to pay the admission. Organizations have learned a lot over this time about the growth in their audiences they can make through digital programming and digital offering, but those things cost money too, and they're not necessarily getting revenue when they offer that. So how can funds like the ones we provide allow them to keep that momentum going? Something we're really wondering about is this may be the way that cultural organizations work seasonally too. You know, many of the historical societies have great places to visit, great grounds to walk. But in the wintertime, when there's less visitation, those digital programs can really keep people engaged, and they're finding build audience. I was in Duxbury last week, and those folks, you know, once they opened up digital programming, and to be clear on some pretty challenging topics about the founding of that town, they had people all over the country that were interested. Are those folks joining the Historical Society or paying admissions? We hope so. But the funding that we provide is to really be able to buttress that and make sure that they have what they need to keep that momentum going.
I know there's a deadline here for applications, August 4th, if I remember correctly. But as far as the criteria for judging these applications, is there anything particular that these groups should be thinking about?
It's open to nonprofits around the state. We really want to see organizations where the humanities are central to their mission and their program. Our emphasis, and this is really what Mass Humanities does best, is to look at the organizations that have budgets of $500,000 or less. So we're certainly going to fund larger organizations, but we know that those smaller, more community-based organizations really have challenges when it comes to meeting their budgets. We want to find organizations that are already reaching audiences that are underserved and get behind that as much as possible. And obviously we want to see, you know, strong budgets that show us where the money is going to go to. So all those things factor in. We do have an August 4th deadline. And what I can say from our experience with the CARES Act grants, which we awarded last year, is my team is pretty good at moving these funds along, getting them out there, and importantly, making sure that all of the regions of the state are covered. We know there are places where there are a lot less options to raise money for cultural programs and funding. It's always been our commitment to make sure that those organizations see Mass Humanities as an ally, and we think these funds will definitely get into those corners as well.
I know this is a field that ripples out into the greater economy, but is there anything else that's coming down the road, at least to help with recovery in the humanities cultural sector?
That's an important question. You know, as I said at the outset, the need is so vast. The impact has been so damaging, and we know the cultural sector is an economic driver. I'm grateful to always partner with the Mass Cultural Council and Mass Creative, and they were really instrumental in helping put together the state's commission on the cultural impacts of COVID-19. What they are now looking to do is to tap into even more of the American Rescue Plan funds. So the state, you know, receives money from the federal government, I think around $2 billion to do that work. The request from the commission is $575 million to really begin this work. And importantly, and I think my colleague Michael Bobbitt makes this point whenever we talk, this isn't just about replacing admission. It's a holistic approach to the cultural sector that says that issues like housing and healthcare, they impact the artist, they impact the local researcher. We need to really think big picture about, again, how we don't just restart that work, but how we're thinking about really cementing the place of the cultural sector in society and in any of these communities. That type of investment, that use of the American Rescue Plan funds the state received, I think is a really wise way, one, to get the economic engine going again, but two, as we've been talking about, how to do an inclusive rebuild that really brings a lot more people in. The cultural sector is the primary and logical way to do that.
And finally, Brian, if people want more details about the shop grants application process, is there a place online where they can find that?
Sure thing. They can go to masshumanities.org. All the information is there. We'll also have a video up of a workshop we did earlier this week to really train applicants on working their way through the application. So masshumanities.org is the place to go, and our staff is always willing to help.